Brzezinski model, the technocrat model, is much more interested in the incremental.
All right, welcome. David, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. We are live.
Perfect.
Yep, glad to have you back on, my friend.
Well, thanks for having me, brother.
Sorry, it's been a while. That wasn't intentional.
No, don't worry about it. I know how it is trying to make content all the time.
Yeah, it's becomes a never-ending thing that consumes the whole day and all your life. So
Yeah. It's a hamster wheel. You're definitely running on continuously.
All right, well, we decided to cover a book that this was actually one of the first books I read when I started looking into Orthodoxy in about 2007. I read this, and I read Dr. Sherard's book, Greek East, Latin West. Both of those books have their merits. I think Lossky's book is superior. I would not recommend Sherard, not because he doesn't have insights, but the later period of Sherard gets really into perennialism, unfortunately, even though Sherard does have some great texts like Greek East, Latin West and Church Papacy Schism. Those are both good books worth reading. However, we get more of a solid orthodoxy out of Vladimir Lossky, and so just my initial statement out from the outset is just to say that rereading this book 10 years later, 13 years later, I guess, I have a lot better understanding of what he was saying. I was kind of new to the concepts in 2006-07, so I didn't really know all the implications of the logi and the energies and creation being triadic, and I was new to those ideas. So it introduced me to it. It was starting to click around that time. Rereading it, however, I see how clear it is, really reinforcing all of the apologetic points, all of the contra-Protestant, contra-Roman Catholic points that I've been making in the last few years. Really heavily breathed the spirit of St. Maximus, of Gregory Palamas. And what Lossky does is much like Father Staniloy, much like Jean-Claude Larcher, much like Father Florovsky, they remain faithful to the Palamite interpretation. This would be the Palamite interpretation of the Eastern Fathers, of Maximus, of Dionysius the Areopagite, because you will get in the West a Thomistic reading of Dionysius. And so I just want to lay that out, that with those 20th century guys, we have a consistent presentation of what Orthodoxy is. And I think that really Lossky is going to be one of those key voices in that milieu that will back up this interpretation, because a lot of people today are going to say, oh, Orthodoxy can be combined with Roman Catholicism. Orthodoxy is just Palamism is just one flavor amongst all of these different ideas of Orthodoxy, and really that's not true. And so even though I'm almost done, even though Lossky's not perfect in his theology, he has some errors that I think are a little off. I critique that in my book when I did the analysis last year of his recently released Dogmatic Theology, which is another complement to this book. I would say this book comes first. Dogmatic Theology is a little more difficult, a little more in depth. But again, definitely this is a thing to come back to and to chew on. And it's a great introduction to Orthodox theology after reflecting on this 10 years, 13 years later. What are your initial thoughts before we get into it, David?
Well, I would agree that I love how chapter 2 technically, but he begins with the sort of apophatic, cataphatic distinction, and that apophaticism, which he's emphasizing, really leads you into understanding the energy essence distinction, which he's going to get into 2 chapters later. And really the chapter on the uncreated energies is like a Dyer hits. He goes, Palamism isn't, energy essence isn't Palamism, it's orthodoxy. He gets into absolute divine simplicity. He gets into pure act and how that puts limitations on the essence of God. So it's that 3rd or 4th chapter, it's like it hits on a lot of things that I heard you talk about when I first started getting into orthodoxy. And so I really enjoyed it. I had read bits and pieces of it, and then you said, "Hey, let's read this. You have this book." I was like, "Oh yeah," and then I was like, "Well, geez, I don't want Dyer to start running circles around me, so I better reread the whole damn thing."
Well, you actually beat me because I'm only halfway through my second reading, so you're ahead of me. So what we decided to do was to split this up, and then we'll do the second part either on my channel or over on your channel in the next day or two. I've got so much stuff that I'm trying to get through. I do have planned, by the way, for everybody, discussions on the Ambigua. So we will go through the entirety of the Ambigua in the near future. We're going to go through Volume 1 of Staniloi's Experience of God. And again, we're going to see that Staniloi and Losky are very much on the same page. If you do make it through Mystical Theology by Losky, I would say then move on to his book, Dogmatic Theology. And I have a whole talk, 3-hour talk that accompanies his Dogmatic Theology. And then maybe if you want to, people who are interested in these topics, progress on to the Aristotle East and West book by Bradshaw. And some of what we're going to be talking about tonight will relate also to the very difficult, this is probably the most advanced text. I would not recommend anybody start with this text because you're going to find it super difficult. It's the most advanced treatment of Orthodox stuff I've ever seen, and it's Tollefson's book on the Cosmology of St. Maximus. The whole book is just on the Logi. So it's one of the classic, well-known works on the Logi. Of course, the Byzantine Christ by Bathrellos will relate to this as well. And also Vesha's book on the person of Christ, the Theology of Emperor St. Justinian. So those are good correlated works. Again, the Losky book, Dogmatic Theology, that was recently released, will be the most relevant to what we're going to talk about today, and also the Staniloi, Volume 1. So if we get into this, now we both looked at Dionysius, and Losky's going to begin here talking about the divine darkness and the notion of apophatic theology. This is where we start, because in our view, the God that's revealed to us is a God who chooses to reveal himself to us. It's not a God that we go out and speculate when we look at nature and we say, let's sit back in armchairs and let's read Plato and Aristotle and let's see what kind of a God we could come up with as a concept. Rather, that Hellenic notion is contrasted to the Hebraic notion of a God who is self-revelatory precisely because he infinitely transcends created being. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I loved on page 27 where he talks about apophaticism as a sort of catharsis. And it's a sort of purging ourselves and a purifying ourselves so we don't create idols and concepts of God and begin to worship those, as we see in Hellenism, as even we see in the Hebraic tradition with what he calls the monarchy, the emphasis on the single, the monad. So not in the same sense of Neoplatonism, but that kind of monarchical emphasis.
Yeah.
So I loved it because he uses that apophatic approach through the rest of the chapters.
Well, now, and part of the reason for this is that he was the student. I'm thinking student because Etienne, or he is the student of Etienne Gilson, the famous Thomist medieval scholar. And Gilson, of course, was faithful to Aquinas, and Losky, of course, departed from that. He did not accept that being Orthodox. He, of course, maintained the Palamite, which is really just Orthodox understanding of Dionysius. And so really we have to start with Dionysius when we look at essence and energy, when we look at the Logi, when we look at what he calls the divine processions. When Dionysius calls them the divine processions, he means the exact same thing as the energies, as the Logi. He identifies the Logi as energies, as Dr. Bradshaw says. So,
and I love how he takes Dionysius back from the Platonist, because that's a common thing. You even hear it. I think I've heard it amongst Orthodox talking with Dionysius having Platonizing elements, and then he really purges that again through the apophaticism, because the beginning approach is going to be revealed. It's going to be through revelation. It's not going to be natural theology.
Yeah.
It's not going to be about the philosophical tradition of Hellenism. And so even though he talks about the language, about the Aristotelian concepts, the Platonic concepts, the language that he's using, it's in a totally different approach and understanding of what God is.
Yeah, he will later say in the third or fourth chapter that there's a transformation of the terminology. This is something that Father Deacon Dr. Ananias and I have discussed in pretty much every talk that we've done. I mean, we've done multiple streams where we discuss the terms and the concepts and how they are transformed. They're not a one-to-one correspondence between the way it's used, for example, in, when Plotinus talks about hypostasis, right? Or when the Stoics speak of logos. It's not, the logos spermatikos is not even the same thing as what the logi are. And I would say that's actually, it's very nuanced, but that's one of the first things Tolleson covers in his book. He says, look, let's dive into the terminology and the different schools and influences that Maximus can freely pull from without adopting wholesale the boxed-in definitional ideas from any of those systems. So Maximus can pull ideas from Aristotle. He can pull ideas from the Neoplatonists. He can utilize the Logi doctrine, which is a Neoplatonic idea. However, one could, of course, debate whether that originates in the Neoplatonists or Platonists or Plato, or whether you want to go back to Hebraic tradition. The point is rather that it doesn't matter, because truth is truth wherever it's found, and we can purge things of the false ideas. We can pull from all these systems, which is why Maximus can use, for example, the Porphyrian tree, right? The transcendental categories of Aristotle. He can transcendentals, by the way, are not the same thing as transcendental arguments. He can pull these things and redefine in a new way. And that's the first thing that Tolleson deals with in his chapter on the Logi, is that when we have this Porphyrian tree, which is from the Isagogy, you'll notice there that you see the different categories of being and structures of the created world. They're very similar to Aristotle's categories. But, for example, he will kind of chart this out like at the beginning you have substance, and then substance is divided into, I think it's corporeal and incorporeal. The corporeal are divided into animate and inanimate. The animate is divided into sensitive animal corporeal and insensitive animal corporeal. The sensitive is divided into rational animal and irrational animal. Very similar to the kind of kingdom phylum structure of Aristotle, this kind of stuff. But the most important thing that we want to understand that Losky will bring up, and I'm not trying to go off key here, but it relates to Dionysius, because what do we say to the people who always claim, this is Neoplatonism, this is Neoplatonism? Well, all of Tolleson's chapter 2 is dedicated to refuting and showing how Maximus is decimating basically the Neoplatonic presuppositions. Why would that be? Well, all of the ambigua are actually written to refute Origenism, right? So the totality of the ambigua is refuting the Neoplatonic mistakes of Origen and Origen's influence in the history of the church. So there's 3 points that he says against the Neoplatonists. This is pages 55 through 63. Creation is a real potentiality in God. It's not something that God necessarily had to do. So there is a dunamis, potentiality in God, that God doesn't have to bring to actuality. That alone shows that we don't believe in actus purus. The essence-energy distinction in St. Maximus, according to Tolleson, is directly connected to the belief that God possesses free will. His will is not identified in the sense of its actions with its essence. Otherwise, God's will would be determined. Hence, no ADS. Thirdly, the essence of God transcends all created categories and relations. And so, therefore, the logi as thought wills are proven to be connected to the doctrine of ex nihilo creation that God freely does. So what Plotinus does, where he has logi be these kind of necessary emanations, Maximus transforms those to being inhypostatized, in the sense that the created order, the logi, come to us as in a personal way by the will of Christ, not by the essence of God. And hence why the divine ideas, the logi, as Losky will say in his whole chapter on created being, are not identical to the essence of God as Augustine and the Latin tradition would do, particularly Aquinas as well. Anyway, so that's why we have to understand that we are not wholesale adopting some Neoplatonic scheme out of Dionysius, even though Dionysius does have elements that are Neoplatonic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, reading this, it left me pondering a question in regards to your own perspective on the idea of like apokatastasis and the recapitulation and how that relates to individual will, because it seems like, and you know, I asking you to correct me where I'm wrong, that if hell isn't eternal, so giving more of the sort of originistic view, which I've heard people talk about online, that is a sort of negation of free will, and that being the central feature of us being made in the image of God. I don't know. I see a major contradiction there. It seems like that hell, given that these angelic entities are refusing, that, you know, evil has a negative existence. It's just the lack of following God's will. It doesn't have a positive existence in and of itself. It happened within eternity. And then us being made in the image of God, I think this is in chapter 5 or 6. It left me thinking just how I've heard other people talk about the recapitulation. And it just seems like it starts to take a sort of Neoplatonic framework that if everything's going to end up back in the logos, well, it doesn't seem like individual free will matters a whole lot, because it's all going to end up back in the logos. And so I've heard that this is sort of debate within Orthodox. You know, just curious where you stand, how you understand all this, because it seemed like there's a contradiction there, and I'm just trying to wrap my mind around human free will and then the eternality or the lack of the eternality of hell itself.
Yeah, so Ambiguum 41 will mention the recapitulation. So 41 is really difficult because it's the one where he mentions recapitulation of even the universals. So it's one of the most difficult of the Ambigua. 42 is difficult as well. Let's see. So I've got all these marked. Let me tell you where the other, if a person does want to read Maximus himself on what he says about recapitulation. I've got so many notes. Like, I've got notes on every page, so it's like trying to flip through and find my recapitulation statements. By the way, I just posted the other day a quote from the presently almost done translation of St. Gregory Palamas' apodictic treatise on the Spirit. So Father Hears is about to release that. My friend Father Moody has translated that text, which Meyendorff mentions in passing in a couple places. I mean, he has some good quotes in Study of Palamas, Meyendorff's book, from that untranslated work. So we know that the approach that Father Moody is taking is correct, because it's anti-Latin in its approach. But point being is that Palamas mentions the recapitulation as well. St. Cyril of Alexandria, of course, teaches recapitulation. Let's see. I just want to make sure I've got. Now, I think Ambiguum 10 also mentions recapitulation. It's first mentioned, of course, by, well, we would say Paul, but it's mentioned by Irenaeus in the and Against Heresies. Mm-hmm. So recapitulation is not necessarily the same thing as apokatastasis, because Origen has a view that because his view of simplicity and his view of the human will, he thinks that the will is determined dialectically on the basis of moving out of a place of perfect stasis into change. So he sees the fall of man as being in a state of perfect stasis, and then moving into a state of change and becoming, and then that leads to being put into the garden. We don't believe that. That's crazy. That's condemned, of course, in the Confession of St. Sophronius. So Maximus is going to partly be refuting that, and so because of the Platonic principle that Origen has in terms of the divine ideas, Maximus has to stress and explain how the divine ideas are energe, how they're logi, and they're not identical to the essence of God. They are thought wills, and not determined ideal causes themselves, right? Because if they were ideal causes, we would be Platonists. So when we come to recapitulation in terms of Maximus' conception of the Eschaton, one of the great things that he does to really clarify this is to utilize his anthropology and his distinction between nature and person, between existence in itself or nature in itself or hypostasis in itself, and the mode of existence, the mode of nature, the mode of hypostasis. So these things are all distinguished in Maximus so that he can explain how there will be a universal restoration of the whole cosmos.
Right.
And so the whole cosmos will, in different ways and in different modes, participate in God. So the saints will participate in God in a unique way through theosis that plants and animals will not. Even though we can speak of them as being transfigured, obviously a plant is not going to be participating right in theosis in the same way that we will, because we become sons of God, right? We don't just become gods, we're actually participating in sonship, and hence why our theosis is also in hypostatic. It's also personal. It relates to the triad, to each person of the triad. So in the Eschaton, and David the Real Mad White did a really good video on showing how the Fordham Universalist types, the Origenist promoters, what they're doing with Maximus is, they're not grasping the distinction between nature and person and how it's used in Maximus in terms of mode, the thing in itself and the mode of willing. Or this is where Maximus comes up with gnomic will, for example, in terms of his.
I was going to ask you how this related to gnomic will.
So in other words, so gnomic will is it's used in different senses, but it's strictly speaking, it just means the mode of willing proper to a created hypostasis. Right. So this is one reason why, of course, Christ in the incarnation doesn't possess a created hypostasis, because he would have a gnomic mode of willing if he did.
Right.
After the fall, it's used mostly in Maximus's arguments and apologetic for the mode of willing proper to fallen humans, proper to the falling created hypostasis. So because Christ is a divine hypostasis, however, he doesn't possess that mode of willing. However, Maximus does in a couple places use it also of the saints in the Eschaton, that we will unite our no me to the love of God. So we will still be willing. So how do we maintain free will in the Eschaton? And one of the arguments is that free will is not defined, like Origen said, dialectically as a choice between good and evil. It's a choice between multiple goods. And so therefore we have to be able to actually choose and will different things in the Eschaton to have free will. Well, how do we do that if, say, the Roman Catholic doctrine of beatific vision is true? It's impossible. So actually the Roman Catholic beatific vision doctrine is closer to Origenism, because if you were to ask a Roman Catholic, well, what if I will something other than God? Well, you can't. Well, what if I did? Well, then that would be falling away. That's the Origenist conception, right? So in the Maximian and Maximus is very clear that in the Eschaton we will be willing the things around God, right? The things around God is used by Cappadocians. It's used by Maximus, just to speak of the energies. And again, the logi are energies. They're a different type of energy. They're not the same as what are called the natural energies or natural attributes of God, such as God's eternal love and eternal glory. If they were the same, then creation would be eternal. It would be synonymous with God's eternal love and glory, which is ridiculous. Hence, they're called thought wills, right? So they're also not created essences. And of course, Losky points this out, that this is a common mistake people make to identify the logi with created essences. That's a mistake that sometimes Platonists make, that Roman Catholics and Thomists make. That's because they don't have the essence energy distinction and they don't understand the logi. This isn't even the stuff I'm saying isn't even controversial, by the way. People are confused over this. It's not even controversial. Every Orthodox theologian will tell you this.
And it's so obvious, the beatific vision, you're talking about how Catholicism falls into a pattern much more consistent with Origenism.
Right.
And given the problems with natural theology, given with, Origen picking up the philosophical, the Platonic tradition,
right,
it's kind of inevitable, that they fall into these same conclusions, these same patterns. So where are you then on the eternality?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot to address. No, so I forgot to address the how we will be willing in the Eschaton in terms of the righteous and the damned. So the restoration of universal nature does not mean that every single created hypostasis will be restored and participate in the same way and in the same mode. So your nature will be restored. That's the only basis for everybody being resurrected. But the way that you, as an individual distinct hypostasis, utilize your natural mode of willing will determine your experience in the Eschaton. So the Eschaton begins now. It begins in this life. We already begin to hate or love God, right?
Right.
When we move into the Eschaton, when the resurrection occurs, we are all determined. We're all predestined to be resurrected, even the wicked, even the reprobate. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do is ask a Calvinist or even a Roman Catholic, on what basis are the wicked resurrected? There's no reason. Well, but if you believe in recapitulation, you would know, because Christ assumed human nature in a universal sense to recapitulate all human nature in his single divine hypostasis. This is common in the Eastern Fathers and Cappadocians. It's not even controversial. St. Cyril says it very clearly. So what happens then is that in the Eschaton, your nature is restored, but the way that you will experience that restoration of nature is determined by you on the basis of how you utilize your unique mode of willing. So it will be ever ill will or ever good will, dependent upon your unique individual mode of willing in this life. So that's how Maximus answers this dilemma, and he says not everybody is determined in their hypostasis to experience the same existential feeling of what's going to happen in the Eschaton. We will all be experiencing the energies of God, but for some it will be torture because they hate God and they utilize their unique hypostatic will in a bad way, and they didn't, what Maximus says, recapitulate the virtues in themselves and move back into harmony with their logi. If you don't do that, then you are out of order, you're out of whack, and the experience of the Eschaton, which is the same, basically the river of fire is the same as the river of life, you see.
Right.
It's the same energy of God, but experienced existentially in different ways based on how you willed in this life, either practicing virtue, loving God, or not. So that is not alterable in the Eschaton. The only area of speculation that occurs that I could maybe see granting some, I wouldn't call it infant limbo, but Nyssa speculates that maybe at the end of the ages there could be some kind of natural restoration of maybe infants who died or something like this, or he thinks that in the aeons of the Eschaton that eventually at some point even the wicked will choose the good. But when Florovsky comments on this, he says that even that doesn't necessarily mean that they participate in theosis. Now, I don't think that that's correct. Nyssa.
Is this one of your criticisms of Losky?
No. This has nothing to do with Losky. I'm talking about.
Oh,
you asked about apocatastasis.
You thought Losky was incorrect in what he was saying.
No. This is not about Losky. So you asked about apocatastasis, and I'm saying
right.
So the main area that this comes from is Nyssa, right? So St. Gregory Nyssa speculated, because he was very influenced by Origen, he speculated that in the Eschaton, if beings do retain their natural will, then possibly if they retain free will, at some point in this infinite future aeon, they could choose the good. Mm-hmm. But you can't participate in theosis, right? So Florovsky has a chapter where he, I think, solves this dilemma by saying that perhaps Nyssa is saying that they will choose the good in terms of natural goods, but they can't participate in theosis proper, because that's only for the saints in the church. Now, I don't think that that's true. I'm saying that I think Florovsky has the correct analysis of what Nyssa is trying to say. But we know that Maximus and these other people aren't teaching universalism, you see.
Right.
So what people like David Bentley Hart will do is they'll go to this and they'll say, you see, he's teaching universalism. Everybody's going to be saved. Without looking into the nuance of the fact that, Maximus is actually disagreeing with this. He's rejecting these ideas and mistakes. Nyssa is speculating, and yes, maybe a couple other people like St. Isaac the Syrian speculated like St. Gregory of Nyssa did. But even their speculations are not necessarily declarations that everybody's saved. It's not. Because we know that not everybody will participate in theosis. So I'm just saying that it's more nuanced than the Fordham people want to make it. It's not about, was Origen a good guy or a bad guy? It gets into, I think he was a heretic, right? So it gets into the nuances of how Maximus spends all these ambigua refuting the Origenist errors. I think Losky is correct. I don't think Losky makes these mistakes. I don't think he teaches, he seems to, in in dogmatic theology, he says that he thinks Maximus corrected mistakes in Nyssa.
Right, that's what it seemed like he was saying with the, how does he say, I forget which word, it's almost like the indestructibility of free will or something like that, the sort of eternality of free will in terms of being made in the image of God. And so it seems like, just like you're saying, that he would be more in line with Maximus the Confessor. Yes. But I've just been seeing, again, just like the toll houses, there's so much more complexity within Orthodoxy than I was aware of. One of the mantras we always say is that it's we have all these different churches, but we have a unified theology. And then, since, after about a year and a half of actually being Orthodox, or at least going to church, I'm still a catechumen, but I see, wow, there's a lot more controversies within the church than I was aware of. And it seems like what you're talking about with Max, that like logically that has to be the case.
All right. So Maximus has a version of the apocatastasis that is not Origenism, that is recapitulation, but still has a place for the individual created will choosing the way that it will experience the eschaton. And he does not, I'm not aware of any place where Maximus believes that the unrighteous can be saved in the eschaton. I've never heard anything like that. I don't think he says that. Again, I'm just trying to illustrate that it's actually St. Gregory of Nyssa that people like David Bentley Hart or whoever else wants to defend universalism. I think Ware even kind of speculates on this a little bit.
But you see he just came out in favor of homosexuality?
I had seen him make a statement like a year or two ago about that. But I always...
Well, he just made a recent statement.
I didn't see it recently.
So it was it's out there. It's
well, I'm not surprised. He was. I was suspicious of him 10 years ago. It's part of the reason I didn't become Orthodox 10 years ago. Was I was suspicious of these people. Anyway, so I'm sorry for. Hopefully that's helpful.
No, that was a great explanation. No, I appreciate that. So that seemed what. In my mind, that seemed it had to be the case. And when I've just been doing some reading, and I've seen Orthodox people that are probably Fordhamites. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure, what their credentials or stuff were, just reading articles and stuff online. And it's like, geez, well, if the recapitulation, if the apocatastasis is going to all be back in the Logos, it just seemed like there was a negation here of will. And it seemed like, well, that can't be it. That's Neoplatonism. It's totally taking the same framework, the same architecture.
Every one of the struggles that, I'm not trying to be arrogant, I had the same struggle. So there was a period where I had wrestled with this issue, and I'd read Nyssa, and I thought, well, maybe the universalist idea is right, maybe. But I didn't understand the nuances that Maximus later introduces to resolve this, relating to gnomic will. And how even in the eschaton the distinction between nature and person is relevant, and also the fact that we have the ability to will multiple goods. So when evil is removed as a possibility for the righteous when they participate in the fullness of theosis in the eschaton, they don't lose free will. Right. They have the ability to will multiple things, which means that there has to be real multiplicity in God. There has to really be triadic, hypostatic reality and many energies, you see. So... well,
that was great. You want to move on, at least get back to our text?
No, but I'm glad to discuss that because those things come up a lot. And hopefully that can be helpful to people who, will have these same struggles,
right?
When they encounter these issues.
No, that was a great explanation.
So did you have anything else that stuck out to you in the apophatic chapter? Divine darkness.
Let's see here. I got tons of little page notes here.
Maybe we should mention apophatic and cataphatic because it's important to understand that we're not. This is a mistake a lot of Roman Catholics make when they hear about what we talk about. They'll say, well, you guys don't believe in cataphatic theology or saying anything positive about God. You just believe in negative theology, and so it's all mystical, and you don't have any actual logic or theology. That's not true. Completely not true.
What an ignorant thing to say.
Well, I mean, you hear it all the time. It's a common objection. I mean, I heard it when I was new. In fact, when I was new to Orthodoxy and I was reading like the trad critiques or the former Lacaudus, who used to be Orthodox and went Roman Catholic. I mean, he would say this: "Oh, they don't even do theology; it's just mysticism, and that's what they don't understand. Apophatic theology is, all this stuff."
Wow. Well, it seems like the apophaticism it's not that we don't say cataphatic statements. It's just that we have to make a distinction between creator and creation.
Exactly.
I mean, and you can only do that through apophaticism. So once we have delineated the distinction between creator and creation, well, now we can still say positive things about God through his thought wills, through the logoi, through these uncreated energies, through the ways in which he communicates to us. But his essence is still totally transcendent. It's behind the dark cloud of unknowing. And so, go ahead. Look like you're going to say something.
Well, there's a mistake here that you may wrestle with. I don't know, but some of the Orthodox are still wrestling with this. I wrestled with this one for a long time because one of my friends was a big devotee of Father Romanides. Now, Father Romanides has some good insights. He's not wrong about everything. I'm not going to judge him personally, but I will say that where I think it took me many years to figure out what the problem was. Where he is incorrect is that he's pretty clear that there's no analogia at all. There's nothing analogical between not just the essence of God, but even the energies. Since the energies are uncreated, there's no way that there can ever be any created analogia that's spoken or related to or images the uncreated. But the problem with this becomes, well, number one, the church fathers constantly talk about analogia. It's everywhere. They mention it many, many times. Right. The common analogy of the church fathers of the Father as the mind, the Son as the logos, the thought, and the Spirit being the breath, the wind, the will, etc. These are common triadic analogies that are used. Analogia to the energies is the Orthodox position, and this bothered me for a long time because I had read enough of the Church Fathers to know that they do use analogy. Jesus uses analogy. He says that if your Father on earth won't give you stones when you ask for bread, how much more does your Father in heaven? That's an analogy between a human father and a heavenly Father. Obviously, the term Father. And now it just makes me mad because it's so absurd for people to take issue with this. And they make the mistake of thinking that the problem of all religion is analogy. That's Romanides' idea, that all religion is erroneous because it's based on analogia. No, the problem with analogia is when you predicate of the essence of God, right? So that's what Thomism does. Thomism says that we can cataphatically and apophatically predicate of the essence of God because of absolute divine. So that's the problem.
Yep.
And then Romanides says, well, the reason I reject this is because the Synodicon says that we can't believe in divine ideas. Well, I'm sorry, but all the Eastern Fathers teach the Logi. They teach that they are divine ideas. And every treatise on the Logi will tell you that they're divine ideas. So how do we reconcile this? Well, Maximus has reconciled it. The Logi are not the essence of God. They're energies. So yes, creatures do match up to, they are analogous to their uncreated Logi. They're the the Logi are the pattern. It's not going to be a pattern if there's no similarity or connection. That makes no sense.
Right.
Image archetype. This is constant in Orthodox theology. So, by the way, many church fathers, even Palamas has no problem saying that the Spirit is the love of the Father and the Son. However, that is not applicable to the hypostatic origin. Right. It's applicable to the level of energetic manifestation.
Yeah, Lasky talks about that in this book.
Thank you. Exactly. So I'm sorry for all those rants, but first thing I would say, the really great, the Trinity chapter is phenomenal. I mean, I wish that I could. I mean, he goes in 20 pages. He summarizes Orthodox Trinitarian theology almost flawlessly. I couldn't find anything in the Trinity chapter that I thought was even questionable or at all. I mean, he starts by saying that, first of all, in the Trinity, there's no dialectics, no opposition, no contrasts, because dialectics, dyad, contrast, opposition, those are things that relate to twos. And so the triad transcends all dialectics and all dialectical oppositions because it's a trinity. Wonder where he gets that. Where would we maybe get the idea that this notion of multiplicity is applied to God? Maybe the first ambigua, right? Monad, dyad, triad. Maximus argues that God overcomes the logical antinomies because he is triad. Also in Ambigua 23. Yeah, so Maximus has no problem beginning with the notion of number, the notion of monad, dyad, triad, the notion of the one and the many being used. I mean, Maximus probably 20 or 30 times uses the one and the many argument for the Trinity. And so does Losky because he's faithful to Maximus. But this is a key point because so in philosophy you have this notion of antinomies. And these are just the apparent contradictions of things. So in created logic, we will have many instances where there are antinomies. In creation, there are antinomies. There's dialectical relations in creation. But we cannot read those things back into God, into the triad, because God is not a dyad. And he's also not created. So every time you've heard me say God transcends the logical order, God transcends created logic, that does not mean he contradicts himself. It means that he is beyond it. Created logic is based on the logi, but God himself transcends created logic. How do we know that? Because as he says, probably 5 times, or maybe, no, it's like 10 times in this chapter and the next chapter, God transcends the logical antinomies. All that means is that he's beyond. Let's take the law of identity. Aristotle's law of identity, right? A single simple subject. A substance, right? It can only have the identity that it has based on whatever its essence is. That cannot be applied to God. First of all, because perichoresis, the divine indwelling, would make the law of identity impossible in the Aristotelian sense. Aristotle would say that's a contradiction. We say it's not a contradiction because God transcends the logical antinomies. Right? It's that simple. Go ahead.
Yeah, on 48, page 48, he's actually getting at that at the bottom about why the church has to defend the Trinity at all costs. Throughout history, this has always been attacked because, again, the Trinity, as you mentioned, how it, I think he says, circumscribes the one and the many. Mm-hmm. That, we.
Yeah, Maximus says God is absolute one and absolute many.
Yes, and it's just so beautiful. This chapter, I really love this, and I really love the next one on the uncreated energies and being made in the image. Those were some of my favorite chapters. But like right here on 48, he says, "For the creature, subject to change by nature, can by grace attain to the state of eternal stability, can partake in infinite life in the light of the Trinity. This is why the Church has defended so vehemently the mystery of the Holy Trinity against the natural tendencies of the human mind, which strive to suppress it by reducing the Trinity to unity and making it an essence of the philosophers, which the 3 modes of the manifestation of modalism or Sabellius, or even of dividing it into 3 distinct beings, as did Arius." And then he goes into the Trinity of Plotinus, which in my mind, Catholicism with the Filioque starts moving in that direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. He, what stuck out to me immediately was page 46. He says the triad, now I have an older copy, so it might be, the numbering might be different in your newer copy, but he says the triad overcomes all logical antinomies, and that's a quote from St. Gregory Nazianzus in Oration 11. I read all the orations 12 years ago, so I knew that the Cappadocians frequently utilized Nyssa, Nazianzus, Basil. They frequently utilized the one and the many argument. And Losky notes that here, right? He notes the movement from monad to dyad to triad. The Cappadocians talk that, and talk about that when Maximus utilizes monad, dyad, triad, he's getting it from the Cappadocians and how they are not Neoplatonists, right? They are one of the unique things that the Cappadocians do is stress the priority of a person. hypostasis, personal subject, over essence, essentialism, or nature. So nature is person is what we know, what we come to experience, right? The energies are in hypostatic, Palamas says, because we're knowing a person who's interacting with us. We're not directly knowing the essence of God, even though those energies are proper to God's nature. They're not identical to God's nature, and they're not definitional of God's nature. And so that's why Lofsky starts by saying that the Trinity is a revealed dogma. It's not a dogma of speculation and philosophy. It's not a dogma that comes to us on the basis of what we think is logical or logical categories. And so we can't have a philosophical absolute divine simplicity, as he says on page 48. And then he goes on to make a really important point that, again, I've stressed. We cannot have Thomistic natural theology with that being the case. You see, natural theology is connected to the idea that the content of the natural world is not logi, but rather prime matter. I don't know. I mean, it's something that we go and we look at and we reason up to this first simple substance. But again, Lofsky, being faithful to Maximus, he knows that we can't have natural theology because it's connected to absolute divine simplicity. And the terms, as you pointed out, 49, this is where he says, the Plotinian Trinity is not our triad. There is a transformation of the terms, he says, that are not the same as Hellenism. Therefore, Roman Catholic natural theology is impossible. And he makes this great point that I've said many times. In order to interpret the natural world as well as revealed theology, repentance is needed. You can't properly interpret nature without metanoia. Repentance is needed. And then he goes on to make an important point that many people that we interact with can't seem to figure out or make. And this is the Aristotelian distinction between primary and secondary substances. Primary substances being the individual, and secondary substances being the common universal essences.
Right.
Hellenism is often based on a one and many dialectic. If you've studied Plato and Aristotle, you know this comes up in the dialogues and in even the Republic, the dialectic between the one and the many. In Plato's idea, it's kind of resolved in this ultimate monad unity. He thinks he can kind of resolve everything, and well, if we just boil everything back to the striving for unity, then we'll have everything. And so multiplicity loses its significance. Multiplicity becomes part of the fractured lesser ontological status of this world, right? Hence why Plato wants to free this world and get back to the ideal. You see, the body is a prison. Well, that's not what we say. We don't say that, right? But we're just pointing out that it's St. John Damascene, he says, helps us with some of these terms because John Damascus will utilize in his, not just in Exposition of Orthodox Faith, but also in his philosophical chapters, he'll utilize the one and the many principle for picking out individual substances as opposed to secondary substances, essences. He will point out how person and nature are distinguished. This is common in the Cappadocians, all the arguments you've heard me make endlessly. Hypostatic properties are what we mark the persons with, not relations of opposition, not, as Aquinas says, persona et relatio, person is relation. No, we don't teach any of that. Orthodoxy only identifies the persons, the hypostases, on the basis of hypostatic properties, which are connected to the Father alone being the sole cause or monarchia. If you don't have the doctrine of the Father alone as the sole cause or monarchia, then you can't have hypostatic properties as the way to identify the persons. They do have relations. There are relations, but relations are, as the Soshinsky book points out, relations are predicates. They're not subjects. The persons are the subjects.
Right. And he goes into Lofsky differentiating between ousia and hypostasis because obviously he's saying generically these can be confused. It seems like they're pointing at the same thing, but as you're pointing out, it's about personhood. Hypostasis is about personhood as opposed to more of the emphasis on substance or essence with ousia. And that we have to purge even that term from its Aristotelian concepts of individual versus personhood, because we are interested in person. We're not interested in the individual, this sort of abstract concept.
Yeah, so the Cappadocian notion of hypostasis and ousia, letter 38 of Basil, does not come from Aristotle. It does not come from a idea of just an individual substance. This is an older idea that they innovate on, and I'm not saying that they invented the idea of the Trinity, but everybody knows who knows about this, that the Cappadocians made huge advances in explicating the doctrine of the nature-person distinction, which is fundamental. I mean, John Damascus says the root of all heresies and heretics is to confuse nature and person. And that's why he stresses on 56 and 57, relations are predicates, they're not subjects. To have the Roman Catholic conceptions is to confuse nature and person. Thus, person is not equated to relation, but that's precisely what Thomas does in the Summa in Book 1, 29a4. Persona et relatio. The sole cause, the sole arche, is the person, the hypostasis of the Father, and hence all Orthodox triadology, all the Eastern Fathers begin their Ordo Theology, their triadology, with the hypostasis of the Father, not a common essence. Can we talk about a common essence? Sure. Can we call the one God the whole triad? Can the one God phrase refer to the Trinity or the divine essence? Yes, as long as it's understood to be that the person of the Father is the beginning point and the recapitulation of the triad. In fact, they even say that the person of the Father recapitulates the unity of the triad. That's a Cappadocian notion. So are there relations? Yes. Basil talks about relations. Nyssa talks about relations. Gregory Nazianzus talks about relations. But the relations presuppose the hypostatic subject. They're not identical to it, and hence why absolute divine simplicity does not work, and hence why they had to invent things like relations of opposition and even their notion of the filioque. They would have never had the problem with the filioque if they had kept to the hypostatic properties and the Father as the sole cause, and hence why the Son can't participate in the Father's unique causal property.
And I love how he, in this chapter, then he uses apophaticism to do exactly what you're saying, to differentiate the Trinity, to say that the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit. And so using sort of negative theology, we can maintain personhood within the Trinity itself and not fall victim to essentialist claims. That's going to lead to sort of a modalism.
Good point. Absolutely. And he also notes the mysterious nature, as you've heard me say many times, of hypostasis. We don't even know exactly what a hypostasis is. We can't give a perfect definition because it's something that is at very root. It's very root, mysterious. That doesn't mean we can't speak about it. We can't speak cataphatically. We can. Theology presupposes the ability to speak cataphatically, but again, it's always limiting. It's always, even the cataphatic statements, he says, are also apophatic because they're not a definition. How can you have a definition of what you are or what I am, right? Hypostasis is, it transcends nature, but that doesn't mean that it like goes out of nature or something like that. It's nature is in hypostatized. It always exists in the mode of some individual person, some particular. 64 is good because, in my copy, because he utilizes the absolute divine simplicity points to show how it leads to beatific vision. And then he makes the classic point I've made probably 1,000 times, that the Hebrew God is personal, not Hellenic, and that if you don't accept the Hebrew roots, I don't mean the Hebrew roots movement. We're not talking about black Israelites here. If you don't accept the actual biblical Hebrew notion of the personal God of Exodus 3, I am that I am, that's a statement of personhood, then you have the Neoplatonic doctrine of a false beatific vision mysticism where you try to dissolve yourself into the monad. Now, you would know a lot about that, I think, from your esoteric ideas previously.
That's what it's all about. I mean, it's built on that entire Neoplatonic conception of a sort of blending back into subsuming within the one, and then which leads to, in my mind, again, the tendency in the modern world to always go towards perennialism. You know, they're working off some of these similar presuppositions, and again, they always lead, these thought patterns lead to the same similar conclusion. They manifest in different ways, but once you see it, you never not see it, you know, and it's so easy to spot. And that's one of the things that I love about Orthodox theology, is its uniqueness, is once you start to really get into this stuff, it gives you a set of eyes to then actually analyze the world. And once you start to look at other religious traditions, spiritual traditions, you see all these commonalities
Yes.
that you are in opposition to because of your starting place.
Yeah, exactly. The Ordo Theology has to be the hypostasis of the Father. And then that will lead to all of the other things like the essence energy distinction, like the distinction between nature and person, like the notion of coherence, which is important for Christology. In other words, perichoresis in the triad will also be helpful in explaining the coherence of the two natures and interpenetration in the Christology and the two natures of Christ. So next point that I thought was really good was 65, where he discusses revelation, revealed theology. Revealed theology is key, and revealed theology is what teaches us and tells us who God is, how far we can know God, and that our theology is triadic. It's not a vision of some generic essence. It's a participation in the divine life of the triad. So salvation has to be triadic, just like creation is triadic, just like redemption is triadic. The Trinity is the, what's this quote here? I like the way he said this. This is very Van Tillian. The Trinity is the ground of all reality and thought. I thought that was a great quote. In fact, I'll probably use that in the book we're doing with Father Deacon Dr. Ananias, because that's very relevant to our apologetic. I mean, we have to apply that principle to our apologetic as well. We don't begin with autonomous speculation. We begin with revealed theology, and that's his whole point there at the end of the Trinity chapter.
Right. No.
This is distinguished, for example, from the Thomistic approach, which would say that, well, you can't begin your theology with the Trinity. That's a revealed doctrine. You got to begin your theology with the philosophic approach of natural theology. There's a whole book on 300 pages of how to get to God and know about God without revelation, without the Trinity, without Jesus. Oh, really? Does that really sound like it makes any sense? How are we going to start our system without reference to Jesus? That doesn't make any sense. How foreign is that to John of Damascus's exposition, which begins with the triad? How does Palamas begin his theology books? Trinity. How does Losky begin his theology books? Trinity.
And by starting there, we've already dealt with so many issues. Again, we've already talked about the one and the many. So by starting with the Trinity, as he's highlighting with a quote from St. Maximus, this is on my 63. Based on what you're saying, I think our pages are different. Mm-hmm. But in the words of St. Maximus, God is identically monad and triad. And then he goes on to how you understand this apophatically, in that being as incomprehensible, for its incomprehensibility is rooted in the fact that God is not only nature, but also three persons. The incomprehensible nature is incomprehensible in as much as it is the nature of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Ghost. God is incomprehensible because Trinity, yet manifesting himself as Trinity. And so here apophaticism finds its fulfillment in the revelation of the Holy Trinity as a primordial fact, ultimate reality, first datum, which cannot be deduced, explained, or discovered by way of any other truth, for there is nothing which is prior to it.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah, there will be multiple places in Maximus as well where he will speak of even creation does reflect the Trinity. This would be very problematic for somebody like Romanides. Again, there's nothing in the created order that all matches up to the Trinity or the energies or anything like that. Well, that would be Buddhism. We couldn't know or speak about God if that was the case. All theology is pointless. The Bible doesn't tell you anything. And sometimes Romanides even says that. He says, yes, you can't even read the Bible and understand it. All you know about God is when you have a direct perception of God. Well, again, this overlooks the fact that this is just silly, because we have to have some point of contact between the uncreated and the created, right? And if the energies are also beyond being and apophatic in the sense that they never come to us, then we don't know God, right? The whole point of the energies is lost if we don't know God and if there's no analogia. And in fact, he will actually cover that in this chapter, because we're going to see that for Losky and for us and for those faithful to St. Gregory Palamas, the uncreated energies is the doctrine that relates directly to our view of soteriology. This will have a direct impact on how we believe and view salvation. How do we begin our Ordo Theology? Well, according to him, again, it's the triad. And so because we begin with the triad, we have a real possibility of union with God. Having a real union with God in our theology necessitates uncreated energies, uncreated grace, not the grace itself being created. Right. So he says we can't use created modes of thought to define in a full sense. We can speak cataphatically through analogia, he says on page 68 of my copy. He says, but we have to understand that even that is is an antinomy, the words that we're using. And so he mentions that Gilson even realized this, that there's the gulf between the uncreated and the created is vast, but yet God overcomes this antinomy by stepping into creation. The uncreated energies come into creation. And so they're not something that we never know or never see or never experience directly. This is the problem in Thomism, because in Thomism, that's not really possible. That's why they have to say, well, all you know about God are just these created effects. You don't have a direct experience in this life of God himself, just these created effects, created grace, etc.
Yeah. And in the next chapter on uncreated energies, he's going to specifically address absolute divine simplicity.
Exactly right. So right away, and by the way, this is also something controversial. Losky is very clear, just like Florovsky and just like even Meyendorff. The Palamite synods and councils are dogmatic. They're not optional. This is not a school of thought within Orthodoxy. Losky is very clear on my page 69 that you must accept the Palamite councils. That means Thomism and natural theology are not compatible with Orthodoxy. You can't combine Palamos and Aquinas. I mean, this is so silly. Palamos cites Aquinas and says where he's wrong. When Akindinos is debating Palamos in the debate with Barlaymite, he cites the Summa, and Palamos says, "Yeah, right. The Summa's wrong." So how are you going to combine these two? Oh, I know better than Palamos himself as to what Palamism is, and I can make the two work. Well, that's just a bunch of ecumenist
I was surprised Losky referred to Aquinas as saint.
He's probably doing that as an academic because it's expected. I don't think he would necessarily think that he was a saint in the Orthodox sense because he affirms the Palamite councils on page 69. I think he's just doing it because it's accepted academic speak. But then again, I mean, maybe I don't have any problem saying Losky got some things wrong. He's not infallible, and I have a problem with him making mistakes. But
were there any critiques that you had of him in these first two chapters? No.
My only critique would be he makes some odd statements about the Old Testament and dogmatic theology. Those I think are problematic, but that's the only problems I can so far find. I haven't read everything Losky wrote, so I don't know. But logos, logi, energy, power and wisdom. These are good sections about God's power, God's glory, and the hypostases. Because Bradshaw will do the same thing. He'll discuss dunamis. He'll discuss how that's different from energeia. This is what Losky's trying to illustrate. Again, it's what Losky says in a few pages. I'm not knocking Bradshaw, but Bradshaw says all the same stuff in many, many more difficult scholarly pages. You see.
I haven't finished that one. I've got about the first two chapters of that one.
Okay, well, the first early chapters on Aristotle are the more difficult ones. As it gets into the energies and all that, it becomes more. It'll be clearer, but so he makes the point that I made earlier on page 72 that for Dionysius, the distinctions in God, the processions in God, he speaks of these as energies, right? What Dionysius is calling the divine processions are energies. Distinction is not separation, composition, or division.
Right.
This is the one in the many argument. Again, stressed on page 73. He cites Nazianzus. He cites John Damascus. The energies flow from the ousia, from the nature. They're proper to and signify the nature. Here he also makes the Origenist, the anti-Origenist argument, or the Origenist problematic argument about the generation of the Son that Athanasius makes. That if we don't make distinctions in God between will and counsel and natural generation, which absolute divine simplicity would preclude, then the Son is a creature or creation is an eternal generation. So this is the knockdown argument that Athanasius had against the Arians. It also applies to Origen, and that's what he's referring to on page 73.
I had a question for you.
And 74.
Right in the beginning of this chapter on uncreated energies, he's quoting, I did not know that Etienne Gilson was his teacher. You're saying that he was his, mentor.
He studied under Gilson, yeah.
So he has a brief little quote here from him talking about the fundamental principle of the spiritual life very well. Lower, he says, if only for an instant and at a single point, the barrier between God and man, which is created by the contingency of being, you have deprived the Christian mystic of his God and thus of his mysticism itself. Any God who is not inaccessible, he can dispense with. It is the God who is in his nature inaccessible, whom he cannot do without. And I was going to ask you, it seems like he's using the argument from contingency in a sort of orthodox way because of the necessary nation, the necessary being of God is distinct from creation itself. Mm-hmm. Now, I was just curious because I did a video just explaining what the argument of contingency is, but I haven't heard anybody within Orthodox circles actually try to use it in a sort of presuppositional way, in a sort of framing the necessary being in an apophatic framework. And I was curious what your thoughts on that were.
I think you probably could make that kind of an argument. The problem with a necessary being argument is not so much within the argument itself, whether there's flaws. The problem is more so that it relies on kind of prior epistemic and metaphysical assumptions. So if your opponent grants you those assumptions, maybe you can make that argument. But the problem is that a really astute one might not grant you those assumptions. In other words, you might say something like, well, let's talk about a necessary being. Well, wait a minute. What is necessary? What is a being? You see just the notion of being and the notion of contingency, they already come loaded with philosophical baggage and assumptions that in the Middle Ages weren't questioned. Later they get questioned. So I'm not convinced that they're the best apologetic argument, depending on how sophisticated your atheistic opponent is. Perhaps if it's like a Graham Oppie or somebody like that, they would be sophisticated enough to call you out on that and say, well, I'm a follower of Hume and Quine. I'm going to call you out on all these metaphysical assumptions that you have, and you haven't demonstrated those things. You're just assuming all those things first. First, you got to prove to me that there is being, that there is existence, what this is, that there's necessity to that. That there's perfections and that there's grades of this, and that created being has contingency and it's acted upon. And this is all like grandiose metaphysical baggage that I'm not saying is false or not true. It is true in the Christian paradigm. You can make sense of that. But if you don't have a Christian paradigm, a consistent atheist is going to sit back and be like, you're just using a bunch of metaphysical baggage and loaded terms, and you haven't demonstrated any of that. Why should I believe in any of those things? Right. But you can reframe a lot of these things about contingency into an apologetic, yes, because Maximus does do this in the 200 chapters. He begins in other places. He begins by talking about in what sense God is and is not the first cause, which would relate to created being and its contingent properties as opposed to God being not contingent.
Right. No, I would never say that it would supplant the tag argument, because obviously, given what you're saying, an empiricist critique of this argument, you're going to have to start with a presuppositional framework. But I just hadn't heard online, I've never heard you actually talk about the argument of contingency, and it seemed like because some of the apologetic arguments aren't going to work in an Orthodox framework.
Well,
And
okay,
it seemed like this one would.
Well, no, wait a minute. Why would some of those kinds not work?
So
in this
pure
way?
act, that's an apologetic argument I've seen Thomas make.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying that's not going to work in an Orthodox framework.
Correct.
But the argument of contingency seems like it would work. I'm not saying that you would want to begin there because of the critique of the presuppositions and granting the metaphysical ideas, what you just said. But it seemed like, after the tag, well, it's moving. It works with our theology. Now, if you're in a debate, I'm saying, no, yeah, you're not going to want to begin with that.
No, well, that's why. Correct. That's why Maximus can take all of these Aristotelian, Neoplatonic notions, and he can pull and play with them freely. He's not bound by some philosophical box that he has to squeeze his theology into. His theology is what determines which philosophical things he can pull from. So within the Orthodox paradigm, yes, many of the things Thomas say, many of the things that Fezer says or Gilson says about the structure of the causal relations in the world of metaphysics, we agree with a lot of those things. The problem is that I just have to always, in an apologetic way, stress that we're not Roman Catholics, we don't accept natural theology, and we don't have the same starting point in Ordo Theologiae as those guys, even though within their systems, they do have areas that they certainly share with us. I mean, the mere fact that Losky can, cite Gilson in positive ways shows that he doesn't think Gilson has everything wrong, but he doesn't agree with him on a presuppositional fundamental level of where theology starts and, whether the Pope actually solves anything or anything like that. But yes, you could. I mean, I would say that it's not just the contingency argument. There's a whole bunch of other arguments.
Yeah, the argument for morality. I think that totally works with an Orthodox framework.
Yeah, my only qualification is just that I would tend to have a better, more sound argument. I would tend to reframe all of those things in a transcendental way. So,
okay.
So, for example, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, if you make them, there's a transcendental version of those arguments that I think are sound. I didn't know that. Yeah. So I would say the same thing to the contingency argument that you're making. If you have a transcendental version of it, it's a better, more sound argument. Which is not to say that you couldn't use those arguments to convince people, but again, depends on who you're. I mean, if you're talking
to,
yeah, if you're talking to Graham Oppie, he's just going to call you out on that stuff. We're trying to get a debate with him, so maybe one day we can. But let me see if Father Deacon has any comment on this. He was in the chat. He might have been aching to comment on this arena, but I haven't seen him in a little bit. But yeah, I would just say I would reformulate them into transcendental versions. Gotcha. Again, not because. So this is an argument people say, well, where were all the transcendental arguments in the Middle Ages? So the problem is that the Middle Ages, they weren't asked.
The scholasticism. They're not going to be working on the same framework.
Well, even in Byzantium, they weren't asked the paradigm level questions that begin to be asked after Descartes, after Hume, after Kant, after Vico. Right? These characters start asking questions that had never been asked before. For example, you have people who discussed sign and symbol and this kind of stuff. Aristotle discussed poetics and language and linguistic philosophy, but he didn't ask questions that would later be asked at a paradigm level. So what I'm saying is that when you get people asking paradigm level questions, if you don't answer them at a paradigm level, you're just going to be running in circles, you see. That's all I'm trying to say. So it's not that all the scholastics got everything wrong or all the Thomists got everything wrong. Or that's not the issue. The issue is that if you keep rehearsing medieval arguments when people are asking questions that the medievals didn't consider, you're not going to get anywhere. Hence why someone like a Hume or a Graham Oppie will trip up Thomists and medieval people. You see what I'm saying?
Yep. No, I totally see what you're saying. Again, that's the beauty of the presuppositional approach.
And I think with Father Deacon's essay, as will be probably the first chapter in our book, you will see that the transcendental argument makes the most sense with apophatic theology. I mean, it's like,
Oh, absolutely.
it makes perfect sense.
Losky, it sounds at points at points it literally sounds like he's not saying transcendental argument, but the emphasis on the Trinity, on personhood, on the order theology. I mean,
Stan Eloy is actually who comes the closest to just being a full-on presuppositionalist. And I mean, there's multiple places where he almost makes the tag. I mean, 200, 201. Those are pretty much transcendental argument.
What book is that?
The Stan Eloy book, Orthodox Dogmatics, Volume 1.
Orthodox Dogmatics.
This is one of the best. I always recommend. I mean,
I
Losky's great to kind of start with, but this is not an intro book. It's pretty advanced. I mean, if you know Maximus now and some of these ideas, you'll do fine. But the reason Stan Eloy is good is he's the first, well, along with Losky and Florovsky, Stan Eloy is the first dogmatic theologian to really stress the essence energy distinction in Maximus. Other dogmatic theologies are not terrible, Pomazanski, but they don't really stress the importance of the energies, and they don't. But the guys that we're talking about, Florovsky, Larche, Losky, Stan Eloy, they're very faithful to Palamos, even Meyendorff overall. Although Meyendorff, I think, has some problems, but he's still roughly in that school, that tradition, but which I think is just consistent orthodoxy.
You want to get to him talking about energy essence and how Palamasm, there's no such thing, it's orthodoxy.
Right, exactly. That's what his whole chapter is dedicated to. So the energies are not created effects. Remember that in Thomism, it's structured between God and the creation, right? Cause, God, effect, creation. They don't typically ask the question, the nuance that the Orthodox and the East asked, the layers of theology that the East has. Well, what is the energy itself, right? For the Thomist, that's an absurd question. There is no unrealized potentia in God, right? There's no distinction between dunamis and energeia, or act and potency. They're identical, and they are the essence of God. Obviously, clearly, that's not even disputed that that's what Thomas teaches. But for orthodoxy, energies are not created effects. We're asking what is the power, what is the energy itself, right, in these actions. We do not have a doctrine of created grace. Is there a gracious component to creation itself? Yes, but that is not the Thomistic Roman Catholic Tridentine doctrine of created grace. Energy, I can't read my note here. Energies are the mode of the triad outward. Yeah. So God's essence is internal. It's something that we will never know. The energies are the mode of the triad out ad extra, so to speak, towards creation. But not just towards creation, because remember, there are natural energies or eternal energies that God would have always been manifesting, even if he'd not created. This is a key argument that Athanasius makes. That's in the Florovsky paper on Athanasius and creation. This is his argument against the Arians, right? And this relates ultimately to the Council of Blachernae and the energetic manifestation, which is that this is one easy way to know that there's distinctions in the energies. For example, is a theophany energetic? Yes. Does it happen in time and space at one point and come and go? Yes. Is it eternal? No. Is it uncreated? Yes. So this trips up Roman Catholics because they're like, how is that even possible? Well, Palama says because God overcomes the logical antinomies. Now, is the action of creating the world uncreated? Yes, it's God's action. Is it eternal? No, it happened at one point. Ex nihilo. There's not eternal creations. Is the action of creating the world identical to God's eternal manifestation of love or glory? No.
No.
So there's distinctions, Palamas says in the triads, between the energies themselves. Thus, logi, which are energies, Palamas says, they only relate to the created order. They're eternal, they're uncreated, but God did not have to bring them to be. So therefore they are thought wills, you see. Anyway, I'm sorry. So Philaret on the essence energy distinction, I thought that was a great quote there. There's unity in God. There's eternal generation in God. There's an expansion and a contraction. This is important because this is a Plotinian notion that Maximus will utilize. Tolleson has a really long, difficult section, chapter 3, on expansion and contraction. And basically, this is just the idea that God created out of goodness. That's the why. We don't know how he did all this, but we know that he did it just simply out of his goodness. And so you have God, essentially the triadic eternal reality, spewing forth, flowing forth, different phrases like that are used to suffuse his goodness into a new created mode of being, a new reality, creation, distinct from himself, but yet at the same time created to have the potential to participate in him. And so this is a big point that's going to come up in the next chapter that distinguishes Orthodox theology from most, not all, but most Roman Catholic theology. Only the Scotists and the Franciscans will agree with us on this point. The Thomists do not. We believe that creation was done for the purpose of deification and for the purpose of the Logos. Right. So for us, the incarnation is not an afterthought. So what Maximus does is he says that God created. This was the original expansion. This is on the basis of the Logi. The fall sort of put things out of whack. And so what Christ does in the incarnation is that he gathers these Logi back into himself. The created, I should say, the created patterns, the created reality based on the eternal Logi patterns. He brings them back in the recapitulation in himself as the new Adam. Mm-hmm. Because when Adam sinned, he affected the whole created order, you see, cosmically. So when Christ comes, he recapitulates the whole created order cosmically. Romans 8. So he gathers in to himself all of these things. That's the expansion and the contraction of creation, and that bringing back the contraction is theosis. We are participating in that, being brought back into, being led back into our Logi, which is in the Logos. And by the way,
would you agree that that's what he's getting at in the chapter on the church, in the sense of the transition, sort of in historical time from before the incarnation to after the incarnation, that I forget what he talks about, the sort of grace. I forget how he phrased it, but it can't be taken away from us, unlike it could be from Adam. That we're in a new place anthropologically, and that he could have the status that he was. Of course, theosis was always the point from the beginning, but the fall, he lost something. Whereas once the incarnation occurs, we can never lose that thing that we lost in terms of the grace that is bestowed upon us, the process of theosis by participating in the will of God, that we can still we have free will, we can choose God's will, we can not choose God's will, but we have that will never be taken away from us. This is one of the
well, choice will never be taken away, but in the Eschaton, the gnomic possibility of deliberating and falling into evil will be taken away. So theosis will actually heal the fallen state of our will. And so we will still retain the natural energy of the freedom of choice, but it will just be multiple goods that we choose in the Eschaton.
Right. Well, getting at, he talks about the difference, the Christ being the second Adam, and how we who exist after the incarnation have essentially an opportunity, the ability for theosis that can't be taken away from us like it was after the fall.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah, our state is like Adam and Eve, but also different. So we're not in the exact same situation. Adam and Eve was a unique case. Nothing will ever be like the case of Adam and Eve.
Well, even all the people that existed before the incarnation. So all those people from Adam and Eve, everybody who lived up to the incarnation of Christ, they weren't able to participate in God the same way that we can after the. Huh?
Well, hold on. So they did and they didn't. So
okay.
So Maximus, for example, we'll discuss that the Old Testament saints had theosis. Other saints will speak of Abraham possessing the noetic vision of God, which Moses saw God, right? according to Paul. So that would be impossible if you didn't have grace. So it would be impossible to, unless.
Yes, they did have, but it wasn't. It wasn't. So the way he describes it in the book is that there were prophets, there were individuals.
Well,
but it wasn't for everybody, as it is after the incarnation. Every single person has this opportunity now. Right.
So Pentecost is the key game changer here. So what was the unique experience of select people, the prophets, Isaiah, and other Israelites as well, not just the prophets, but I mean anyone. Paul's very clear in the New Testament, many places, that the only way to be saved ever at any time was through Christ and through grace, even for Adam or whoever. But rather, it's a question of degree and power. So Pentecost is the game changer here, because as Joel says, that what was confined to Israel, Joel says the Spirit will be poured out upon all.
Right. Maybe it was in the chapter on the economy of the Spirit.
Probably.
Maybe that's where this was.
So there's continuity between the Old and New Testament, and also discontinuity in the sense of like the degree and the power. I mean, clearly Pentecost is a new event, in redemptive history. There's no question about it. And Joel prophesied that, and then in Acts 2, Peter says this is Joel being fulfilled. Mm-hmm. The Spirit being poured out upon all, and so in that sense, yes, the degree. So, the thing of 2 Corinthians 3, when Paul speaks of the vision that Moses has, he says what was unique to Moses is really what we're all called to experience. Because Moses saw Christ face to face. We are being now called into that same face-to-face encounter. Right. There's an interesting argument I had not seen, Habakkuk 3 and 4. I'd never thought about that as a reference to the essence-energy distinction. That was an interesting argument from Losky I'd never seen. He says, God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was as the light, and he had rays coming forth from his hand. There was the hiding of his power. So you have this manifestation of the rays and of God going out, ad extra out, and also of God in the sense of hidden ad intra, his inner nature. And by the way, I want to be clear. Some people, some Orthodox are mistakenly under the impression that we know nothing of the inter-Trinitarian life. That's not true at all. The whole Council of Blackernay is there to explain in what sense we do know things of the intra-Trinitarian life. And in fact, we are called to participate in the inter-Trinitarian life in the Eschaton. So that's just ignorance and stupidity. Next, we come to the essence-energy distinction being another antinomy that is overcome in our theology. Barlium and Akondynos cite Aquinas and the Summa, which, again, is not reconcilable with Palamas, as we see here. In absolute divine simplicity, again, the hypostases are relations, and we have actus purus. That is not Orthodox theology. Orthodox theology, page 78, is not built on antinomies, and this is, for example, we would not say that because there's real distinctions in God, that means that God is composed or divided. But most of the time when you're arguing with Roman Catholics and Thomists, they think that real distinctions or multiplicity that's real somehow must equate to composition or division. And that's because of their philosophic assumptions, which we don't share. Human intelligence is limited. Absolute divine simplicity is based on human philosophy. All the arguments you've heard, me saying for so long.
That's what I was saying. This chapter is like a hit of your conversations with Catholics.
It is. He also points out that we have to be faithful to the pillars of orthodoxy: Mark of Ephesus, Palamas, Photius.
Yes.
Those are people that we can't toss aside and say, "Oh, well, we can all just get back with Roman Catholics now because we all believe the same thing." No, the Monarchy of the Father, he says, leads directly to the essence-energy distinction. How many times have you heard me say that these things all hang or fall together? The Monarchy of the Father leads to our rejection of filioque. It's a denial of absolute divine simplicity. It's an affirmation of uncreated grace because of the energies. It all goes together.
Right. Yeah, I like this one little piece where he's talking about, he says, while distinguishing in God the three hypostasis, the one nature and the natural energies, Orthodox theology does not admit any kind of composition in him. The energies, like the persons, are not elements of the divine
Right.
being, which can be conceived of apart in separation from the Trinity, from which they are the common manifestation, the eternal splendor. They are not accidents.
They are inhypostatic. They are not accidental
accidental
qualities. This is what Roman Catholics would do this with John Damascus, where they say, look, John Damascus says there's no accidents in God, therefore there's no energies, ignoring all of his chapters on the energies. Yeah, well, that's because energies aren't accidents. Exactly. They're not accidental qualities. And the only reason they would think that is because they think that distinction must imply composition or division or accidents. It doesn't.
Right.
I mean, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are really distinct, and they're not composed. Right.
Which would you agree begins with sort of, again, the improper order of theology?
Which thing?
Catholics, why they end up there? You're talking about their inability. They start talking about
Yeah, because they begin the theology with
essence,
with a doctrine of what simplicity must be.
Right.
It must be this. When Aquinas rejects John Damascus's argument, he cites Maimonides. He says Aristotle and Maimonides say simplicity can't have real distinctions. Well, then you're not a Trinitarian, dude.
Right.
You're a modalist.
It's amazing how people get there. How can you say that?
There's an endless there's an endless sophistry of casuistry and just invent new things. So energies aren't accidents. This is mentioned on page 80. And then we get into the important doctrine of energetic or eternal manifestation, which again, the Council of Blackrenay, the whole Papadakis book is the best book on this. So Christus in Byzantium, and this is of course George of Cyprus's many arguments that will be the same arguments as Palamos. He was the Patriarch Gregory II of Cyprus. And these will be known as the Palamite Synods. Again, they are normative for us. They have passed into our liturgy. It's not questionable. Every Orthodox person in the world is supposed to believe in the Council of Blackrenay, even though it's not a, quote, ecumenical, because there's no empire necessarily that, well, you could argue it was Byzantine, so in a sense it was imperial, but energetic manifestation is directly related to our doctrine, again, of the monarchy of the Father and the essence energy distinction. You can't believe in energetic manifestation unless you believe in energies. So this is why when you talk to Roman Catholics and they have all their filioque quote mines ready to go in the machine gun, click and paste, all you have to do is point out that, yeah, those quotes that you think prove filioque are actually just energetic manifestation. They're like, what are you talking about? What's that? We don't have that. Well, you don't have that because you don't have the doctrine of the energies, first of all. Unless you're a uniate, which is the inconsistent, crazy position where you can believe in all these things and at the same time not believe in all these things.
Without the energies, you can't have theosis.
Right, but I'm just pointing out that when you...
For the Catholic, I'm just telling you.
Right, right.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I was just saying that the rejection of these energies, it's why they can't have a theosis. They can't have an uncreated grace.
Right. Well, there's inconsistency there because Roman Catholic theology does at times mention deification and theosis. There's many places where the Roman Catholic saints mention this. It's just that their notions are confused. They have conflict.
Is that contextual in a certain time period where they mention that? I'm not as familiar with Catholic theology as you are.
Well, most of the Latin fathers, Hilary, Augustine, Jerome, they'll talk about deification, made like God, theosis. The problem doesn't come until the Middle Ages when you get a lot more specification and there's disputes over the nature of grace, created grace, what is grace. Actually, I think it's post-Trent. So Trent will specify that the righteousness and justification that we get is not the justice that God himself has. That's a quote actually from On the Trinity by Augustine. So when Trent begins to argue for created grace, that's their argument, that's their basis. So it's something that develops over time. But even in the Middle Ages, there's debates over grace and what it is and what it isn't. And Bonaventure disagrees with the Thomists and the Scotists and the French. They all have debates. Doesn't matter because they don't teach our view. The Scotists don't teach our view either. The next point, page 81, The Holy Spirit does not proceed by will.
Right.
And yet Roman Catholic dogmatic theology tends to say that it does. I'm sorry, but that's a huge argument in our favor because they confuse nature, person, will, energy, essence in God. They confusedly think that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the will of the Father and the Son. Excuse me, that's the Arian argument for Jesus. If Jesus is a product of will, then he's a creature. Because everything that's a product of will is creation is a product of will. Then is the Spirit a creature? Right? This is Photius's argument that still holds up. Analogical images are not directly proportional or related to the Trinity. They're not perfect definitions. Will is common to the triad, and so therefore the Spirit cannot proceed by will, or else he would proceed from himself. Even Aquinas noticed this problem. I've got it marked in the Summa Contra Gentiles. The procession of the Holy Spirit. Aquinas notices the problem. How can, if absolute divine simplicity is true, then how can the Holy Spirit proceed from the essence? He would proceed from himself. This is book 4, page 113, 14, 15. Now, I don't think Aquinas resolves that question because he doesn't have the Orthodox theology, but it's just interesting that he did notice that problem. So love, an attribute, common energy or attribute, is not equated to one of the persons.
Right.
Well, how about Palamas saying that the Spirit is the love of the Father and Son? Yes, at an energetic level. That's what he says. Not at the hypostatic or essential level.
Right.
To equate persons and attributes or faculties is the error of Apollinaris. Apollinaris said that the Logos takes the place of the human mind or soul in Christ. But that would be to confuse the faculty of nature with the property of person. That's the error of Apollinaris. So then he also, of course, Losky makes the common critique that we don't confuse theology proper with economy. So the Holy Spirit, Jesus sending the Son, has absolutely no argument in terms of hypostatic origin. Has nothing to do with it. It's a terrible argument. Most Roman Catholics who learn the issues at a deeper level, they stop making that argument. They realize it's a terrible argument. Let's see. The energetic movement is also triadic. The energies move from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. He has a great quote from St. Cyril of Alexandria on the energies. The energies also show us perichoresis, just like the hypostases show us perichoresis. This is interesting too. This is something people misunderstand that Roman Catholic theology, I don't think, gets. I think which is not to say that there aren't some Roman Catholic theologians somewhere that talk about this, but the triadic modes or roles, the tropos. So each hypostasis has a unique role or mode in creation and in redemption. Right? Did the Father die? No. Did the Holy Spirit die? No. The hypostasis of the Son underwent incarnation, death, burial, resurrection. So we have to have a theology, a Trinitarian theology, that allows for each of the hypostases to engage in unique roles or modes without compromising their unity. Only Orthodox theology has even broached this topic. Roman Catholic theology, I don't see. If absolute divine simplicity is true, how does one person come and die? Shouldn't it be the whole Trinity dying?
Yep.
But so you'll notice there on page 83, the Son is the hypostatic wisdom of the Father. And so we get these roles in creation and in redemption. Right. And he will say this again in another chapter 2, chapter on created.
Yeah, the Son renders the Father visible.
Yeah, and on created being, he'll say that in the Logis section, he'll say that the creation is a triadic mode where... let's see, it's page 100. He quotes Gregory the Great and Athanasius. All things are created by the Logos. St. John tells us that all things are made by him. The Council of Nicaea teaches us it is the Father who created the heavens and earth and all things visible and invisible. And later, the Spirit is called life-giving. The Father created all things by the Son in the Spirit, says Athanasius. For where the Word is, there also is the Spirit. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made. Here we have the economical manifestation of the triad, the Father operating by the Son and the Spirit. This is why Irenaeus calls the Son and Spirit the two hands of God. The work of creation is the common action of the whole Trinity, but each of the three persons is the cause of created being in a unique way. Right? This is the tropos or mode that each of them has, the role. That's not modalism, it's just the role in creation. St. Basil, when speaking of this creation of the angels, he says that traces of the manifestations of the triad in the work of creation are present. In the creation, he says, consider the primordial cause. This is the hypostasis of the Father. The operant cause is the Son, and the perfecting cause is the Spirit. Maximus will say the same thing. He will say that the reality itself has a triadic mode of being. Really right. Deep stuff in Maximus. But yes, so you're right. In the next page, 84, moving back to where we were, the Son is the manifestation of the, he is the icon of the Father, right? He is the direct icon of the Father's hypostasis. Mm-hmm. Latin Church confuses the economia with the hypostatic origin. There's no will that ever intervenes between the persons. Will is a common faculty of all the persons. So it's a faculty of nature. Will is not a faculty of person. Energies are natural processions, and they are the basis of theosis. God does not have any parts because he is wholly one, and he is wholly present, and he's wholly revealed in every one of these energies, quoting St. Gregory Palamas. How is that possible? How is it possible for God to be wholly present in every energy, the energies to be truly distinct, and yet God is not composed, does not have parts? Because he transcends the logical antinomies. That's what he says.
Yeah.
He says that God is antinomic without division or composition. Yeah. So he is one in many. He is knowable and he's unknown. He's absolute and he's revealed. Mm-hmm. And he's absolutely one and he's absolutely three. All on page 88 and 89.
And if, at least it was useful for me that the Son being the icon of the Father, it is the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, which then allows us to know Christ. That's what it says. Yeah. Thus, it is by the Holy Spirit that we know Christ, who is both Son of God, and
right.
is the Son that we see the Father.
The Son leads us to the Father. The Spirit leads us to the Son.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
The Son points us to the Father, and the Spirit points us to the Son.
Right. Exactly.
So again, remember that this is very important. It always comes up. The movement, Maximus speaks of the movement in God, from monad, dyad, triad. All that means is that everything, Basil's dictum, from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, which is what Athanasius says, that triadic mode is true for the eternal movement in God. The energies move from eternity. Even if God had not created, the love, the glory, the power of God would be manifested from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. When God creates, the creation of the world occurs from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. And then redemption happens from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, with each hypostasis, as the Gospels show us very clearly, taking on a very unique role.
Right.
Natural energies are not equated to or identical to the energetic causes of creation. That's because creation is by will. This, again, the argument on my page 89 shows us that creation, the logi are not the same as the natural energies, clearly. If they were, creation would be eternal. It would be synonymous with God's glory, with God's love. But no, creation is a specific will, and the logi are thought wills that only relate to being God willing to bring them to be in time and space, Maximus says.
Which avoids some of the the things that the characters that are necessitated on God, like you see in Islam or something like that, where God is a continual creator, something like that.
Yeah, I keep bringing that up. I've never heard a significant response to this, because they will never be able to answer the Origenist dilemma because of their doctrine of simplicity. Even if they have this theoretical distinction between attributes and essence, it still doesn't avoid that central problem, because They will say, well, God is eternally a creator. Really? So how is he eternally a creator if he created in time? at a specific point in time. When they'll say, well, then they'll equate dunamis, potentiality, with actuality. They'll say that, well, he always had the power to create, so therefore he's an eternal creator. Oh, so creating is the same thing as the potential to create. So dunamis is the same thing as essence as well, which again puts them back in the modal collapse bind that the Thomists have. So creation is a revealed doctrine. In the next chapter, maybe we could do this created being chapter will be our climax for the first half.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
By the way, I don't want to hog all this. I feel like I'm yapping a whole lot. Feel free to interrupt or tell me, don't let me.
It's good. I mean, you have spent so much more time with this stuff than myself. So I would expect you to, because you're referring to the ambiguum and all.
Well, you're picking up on
talking about these contexts. When we're talking about, go ahead.
You're picking up. I mean, your first reading of this was probably a better. I mean, I probably understood 60% of this the first time I read it. I feel like you have done better. You've gotten a better handle on this than when I first read this. So, chapter 5, creation is a revealed doctrine. This is going to be problematic for natural theology or trying to reconcile our stuff with Thomistic natural theology. Again, it's true that Thomas thinks that creation is a revealed doctrine, but he doesn't think that you need revelation to interpret the created order. That's the problem. You can go out there and start interpreting it autonomously. But I'm sorry, how can we understand the present world as it is without the doctrine of the fall? We can't, right? Death, decay, predator, prey, those are things that entered into the world as a result of the fall in our theology. So is God, if we look at the world as it is, does it have elements of design? Yeah, but it also kind of looks screwed up. The predator, like maggots feeding on death, that seems a little off, right?
Right.
Is that what God wanted? No. The original intention of creation, you would not have maggots feeding parasitically on death. There would be no death. So you can't interpret the natural world correctly without revealed doctrine, without the doctrine of Genesis. You need Genesis to interpret the world. But contrary to Plato, contrary to natural theology, the doctrine of ex nihilo creation is unique to us, to our theology. I forgot to mention that Tolson mentions that as well, that for Maximus, creation ex nihilo is also an important rejoinder and response to the Neoplatonic critique. The generation of the Word is by nature. The creation of the world is by will. It's ex nihilo. Creation is subject to change. God himself is not subject to change. God is not acted upon. Then we get into a significant, deep discussion of the logi. Everything you've heard me say is what he will say about the logi. He says that they are energies. They are not divine ideas located in the essence of God. That is the doctrine of Augustine in the West, page 95. We contrast this with creation ex nihilo. You just heard me saying that from Tolson and Maximus. The logi are uncreated. They are thought wills. They're not causes. They're not subsisting causes in Platonic ideas or in other mystical things. Creation is a revealed dogma. Orthodoxy cannot accept the Roman Catholic natural theology view. For example, we have no doctrine of the donum super additum, 101. Roman Catholic doctrine of man in the garden necessitates this doctrine of the donum super additum, the super added grace. Right, so there's no perfectly pure nature state in Orthodoxy. The divine ideas are not the created essences of things.
Right.
That's what he says very clearly on page 101.
Yes.
So all the stuff that I say over and over and over is we can't. He says on page 101, we cannot do natural theology. It's not compatible. It's natural philosophy. Naturally, it's not compatible with Orthodoxy.
Right. There's a quote here. I know our pages are different, but on my 101, he says, the world created in order that it might be deified is dynamic, tending always towards its final end, predestined in the thought wills. Right. These latter have the center in the Word, the hypostatic wisdom of the Father who gives expression to himself in all things and who brings all things in the Holy Spirit towards union with God, for there is no natural beatitude for the creation, which can have no other end than deification.
Right? There's no beatific vision. There's none of these, what would eventually become Enlightenment ideas out of Aquinas of natural philosophy, natural rights, a pure state of nature, all this nonsense that doesn't exist in our, because we have a different doctrine of creation. We have a different triadology. We have a different worldview. I also like that he goes into the pretty deep stuff in Maximus about the five-fold division of created being.
Oh, yeah.
Concentric spheres of being. That's essentially what this whole Tollefson text is diving into. Tollefson goes way deep into all the grandiose metaphysical structure that Maximus has inherited and borrowed from isagogy of Porphyry, from Plotinus, from Aristotle, from Plato. Here you can see his diagram of the expansion and contraction of beings,
I see that.
which is just the return to God is the recapitulation and the theosis. There's another diagram that was really good that I wanted to find. So for Maximus, universals are created. So they kind of have a concentric, when he talks about these concentric circles, you can kind of see Maximus's notion of the universal, the particular, the genus, the species. So these unities and these differences in the created order, Maximus will argue, are all patterned on the logi. They are not identical to the logi. Right? The logi are not universals. They're not the essences of created things. They're uncreated patterns, principles, and archetypes that are the patterns of the created essences of things. So here's another example of some of the, I showed you the Porphyrian tree before. This is just another kind of distinction of the Porphyrian division of kinds of differences, right? So objects possess unity and they also possess differences. In Maximus's mind, all of the created world is structured this way on the pattern of the logi, you see. So the constitution of created beings has a one and many relationship that is patterned on the triadic reality. This comes up multiple times in Tollefson's book. It's not even controversial, and yet people want to argue with me over this. There was another chart, but I can't find it. Anyway, we'll look at that another time. But yeah, I mean, Tollefson kind of goes crazy deep into what you read in this chapter here with Losky talking about the metaphysics of the created world. Now, I by the way, Losky also contrasts this with, what we're talking about here is not Jacob Boehme, it's not Paracelsus, it's not Kabbalism, which is all the low IQ arguments that people constantly throw at me. This is Orthodox theology, right? It's not Augustinianism. It's not the errors of Bulgakov. It's not any of that stuff, right? It's not Neoplatonism. We've been very precise in distinguishing our theology from those things. Anyway.
He says the theology of the Orthodox Church, constantly soteriological in its emphasis, has never entered into an alliance with philosophy, and any attempt at a doctrinal synthesis, despite all its richness, the religious thought of the East has never had scholasticism.
Correct. And he also says what does he say about? He talks about Russian cosmism, which would be the millennial Russian Christian socialism, sophiology, which is Gnostic, ecclesiology that's gone astray.
Bulgakov gets into that.
And these thinkers, the idea of the church is confounded with the cosmos itself, right? Same with, and he mentions Kabbalism, right? Kabbalism is like rehash Platonism.
With Hebrew letters.
Yeah, I mean, Just the but this you can see how silly the accusations are. People say, "Oh, you're a Kabbalist, oh, you're a Neoplatonist." I mean, this whole book is essentially arguing against Hellenism and Neoplatonism. So it's just the most annoying low IQ argument that people have.
They really are. And it's so explicit. And that's why, again, I love Orthodox theology, because once you get a hold of these sort of, I'm learning so much. So it's not like I am anywhere near you or Father Deacon Ananias or
I learn new things every day. So don't feel bad.
But once you at least get a foundation, it just gives you a new pair of eyes. Where you're talking about like these arguments, anybody would call you a Kabbalist or Orthodox theology Kabbalistic, or E. Michael Jones talking about us being Neoplatonic. Yeah, right. I mean, that's rich. That's why I love the theology, because once you get a hold of it, you can see things that you weren't be able to see previously, and it is at a sort of paradigmatic level. It's so expansive in scope.
2 volumes of Ambigua against Neoplatonism right here. All of this is against Neoplatonism. So what are you talking about? And again, when you get to Staniloy, you'll find all the same stuff. I mean, Staniloy is deeper.
Yeah, I need to read that.
He's even deeper than Losky. Losky is a more readable person. Staniloy will go a whole nother level deeper than Losky will on this stuff.
What are your thoughts? I haven't got into this, but clergy at my church is saying I got to read this book, Freedom of Morality. Have you read this one?
I have not.
They are telling me this is one of the best books that they've read.
Well, I would say this isn't a good one too. Professor Manzaridis, he has a great book on
the deification of man.
Yeah, on Palamos. So he will make all the arguments I make are made in this book too. Just one of the many arguments. Books that all make this. I mean, I don't know where people think I just make all this stuff up. Like, oh, so I think this. No, I read all these books. I'm not making.
Who is that by? The Deification of Man.
Professor Manzaridis. Mantzarides. Manzaridis. He's a prominent Greek theologian. And then,
gotcha.
If people want a more
what is your favorite book on Orthodox? There's so much reading when you start going down into the Orthodox rabbit hole.
I would say the best theological treatise that I've read is Staniloy's Dogmatic Theology. I mean, this one really is the best at integrating.
And that's Orthodox Dogmatics, Volume 1?
Yeah, it's the best at integrating our Ordo, because it's very presuppositional, it's very transcendental argument-ish. It's really good at Maximus, the Logi. It's really good emphasizing the energies. It's really good critiquing Thomism, Aquinas. I mean, the first chapter is a rejection of natural theology. The first thing he says is the Orthodox Church does not do natural philosophy and natural theology. He says natural revelation would be a better term because that's more faithful to Maximus.
Right.
The difficulty with this book is that there's about an 80-page sort of like going off into a really complex Orthodox conception of time. It's great, but if you're not philosophically astute, I'm not saying you, I'm saying people in general,
right?
They'll have a hard time with that because Maximus has a lot of philosophic discussion of time and how the created God brings the Logi into being in time, the ones that he wills to, and they come to be, and time is movement in space. Time is not in a dialectical tension with eternity. It's just really deep. I've never read any philosophy of time that was. I mean, it's really deep. I'm just going to warn you. It's good though. It's worth it.
Yeah, I gotta check it out.
Also good. This book's not flawless. It has a couple places I would disagree with, but overall, Metropolitan Herotheos Vlachos' book, Person in the Orthodox Tradition, is a good treatment of hypostasis, ousia. But I keep forgetting about this one. If people want a place to start, I always forget that this is if you want an introduction, not necessarily to Orthodox theology proper, but let's say you want to understand the philosophy that's being used here. Pelikan's book, Christianity and Classical Culture, the Metamorphosis of Natural Theology and the Christian Encounter with Hellenism. It's really good. I forgot how good it was, but what he does is he takes you through all the different philosophical systems and where the Cappadocians primarily will agree and disagree. And Pelikan did end up Orthodox, so he's got a whole chapter on the one and the three, one and the many. And he will go through energies, he'll go through logi, he will go through all the conceived arche, telos, in hypostatize. I think he talks about that. Telos, apokatastasis. He may not mention in hypostatize, I can't remember, but maybe he does. I read this 10 years ago, but it's really good.
Awesome.
He'll talk about eidos, divine ideas, matter form, hylomorphism, Neoplatonism, one and many, analogia entis versus essence energy, first cause. This is the philosophic introduction that you would want to read.
Awesome. I wrote it down.
Yeah. Also, I wouldn't recommend everything that he writes, but chapter 1 on, he is a scholar of the Cappadocians. Zizilis is being in communion by John Zizilis. Chapter 1 is kind of a standard on the Cappadocians, showing their battling Greek impersonalism and stressing the personalism of the Father, right, and of Christ, the nature-person distinction. So this book mainly is good for that first chapter. Anyway.
The ones that, Subdeacon Mark, I've done a few videos with him. The ones that he's told me I have to read. Number 1 is Freedom of Morality. But have you read Christus Victor? This is another one he said I got to read.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm familiar with that. I never did get into that book, but it's very popular when I was like amongst, Protestant circles. It's not bad in the sense of what it's going to be arguing for is essentially synonymous with a lot of the church fathers. So I'm familiar with that. I mean, John Damascus argues this.
Meyendorff's Byzantine Theology.
That's a classic. Yeah, it's a good introduction. Yeah, I was really surprised actually that, because I had not read, I have a bunch of other Meyendorff books, but I had not read Study of Palamos. And in the book Study of Palamos, Meyendorff comes out really strongly pro, like, you can't meld this with Thomism. We can't accept the Thomist reading of Dionysius. You have to accept the Palamite councils. I mean, I kind of had a negative view of him, thought he was a little too ecumenical, but he comes out pretty strong in that book. And that Study of Palamos admits all the same stuff you hear me say too. So
yeah, that's what we, Subdeacon Mark was telling me that Meyendorff, that was kind of his bread and butter, was Gregory Palamos.
It is, but some people thought he was too ecumenical, and there's some other places where I do think he made some mistakes, but we won't go into all that. The Study of Palamos is a great book. It's worth reading. Byzantine Theology is good. As one of the first ones I read as well. You ready to do some super chats?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Mike Shearman for $20. He says, I can understand Orthodox Church bowing to Stalin, but not the Wu flu. What are your thoughts? Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we've had to deal with all this. I mean, I kind of expected it given, the geopolitical realm that I look at and study. I figured they would try to put us into these kind of binds. It's unfortunate. I think ultimately the best argument I've heard is from Father Peter Hears. I think he's correct that we should not bow to the whims of the state and medical so-called officials. because
You see Go Arch and their plastic spoons.
yeah, I mean, this is just ridiculous. So yeah, I don't think there's much question. It's really sad that people are. I mean, our theology is not supposed to be determined by fears of insurance claims and lawsuits. I'm sorry, but could you imagine the martyrs? I mean, imagine the martyrs looking at us being like, "You guys are a bunch of cowards."
Right.
And I'm saying I'm a part of this modernity cowardice as well. John, $50. Jay, please do an analysis of Wes and Justin Fall's documentary Belly of the Beast. Okay, I don't know what that is. I'll have to look at that. Belly of the Beast, but if you're gonna pay me $50, I guess I will go watch it. Thank you, John. Jake Berg, $5. Great book. I was glad to see that Losky made the same point. Orthodox versus Latin, Ordo Theology. Yeah, that's not unique to Farrell. I don't know where people got this goofy idea that was. I mean, it's in Staniloy. Staniloy was writing all this same stuff before Farrell. So was Losky. Let's see, when did Staniloy write this book? 94. I don't know when. I mean, he knew about this and made the arguments, of course, before. I mean, he's an old guy, so he probably. I don't know what year God History Dialectic came out, but it doesn't matter. All the arguments are just from Palamas. It's all the arguments Palamas and Maximus makes, not from freaking God History Dialectic. It's in God History.
1995.
Okay, so Losky wrote his book before God History Dialectic. Staniloy did. When did Mystical Theology is way old. This came out way. I have this 1976 copy that I got a hold of, and it just happens to be Father Peter Here's dad, who was a priest. It's Father Peter Here's dad's copy. You can see there, Father Gregory Here's. So I have
in 58.
Huh?
So it had been. I mean, he died in 58. So even though it was published, looks like it's shown as published.
Yeah, it
in
would
the
have to
70s.
be earlier than that. Let's
It's
see.
even earlier than that.
This book was first published in Paris in 1944.
44.
So I guess Losky got in a time machine and stole all of his arguments from Farrell. Robert Taylor, $5. IXOYE, Ichthus, 5 A's. Why does Losky call Aquinas and Anselm saints? We already answered that. Is it because he's speaking to a Western audience? Yeah, or he's writing as an academic. Robert Taylor, $5. Christ Ascended. I can't watch this live, but glad you're covering. Losky recommending it to my Catholic friends. One of the best modern Orthodox works. Yes, I think what's so good about this book is that he summarizes things so quickly. Like, he's not writing this 7,000 page treatise. He's writing it, he covers the energies perfectly in 20 pages. What do you think? Any comments on that?
No, I agree. I think it's a really useful summation of so many different things. I mean, you're getting ecclesiology, the uncreated energies, the economy of the Son, the Holy Spirit. I mean, the Holy Spirit, to me, that's a big one, the role, because I took a course when I was back in Berkeley on the role of the Holy Spirit. And so we got big into Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox different understandings.
Right.
And I mean, for much of Protestantism, the Holy Spirit's totally absent. It's just a worship of Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Losky makes that point that the triadic focus is lost in Protestantism, especially.
Agreed.
Which is obvious. But also, I forgot to ask you, there was a book I was going to ask you about. I forgot. Anyway, maybe I'll think of it. All right, let's see. Marco Acuna, $10. Jay, I've been watching you for a year now. Well, thank you. I'm honored that you would watch me for a year now. By the way, I remember what it was. Losky has another smaller book that's good, Image and Likeness. That's also good. About the Eastern Fathers' conception of man in the garden and the being made in the image of God and the likeness of God, and then losing the Holy Spirit in the fall, losing the likeness, and then regaining the Holy Spirit is the work of theosis. Let's see. Thank you, Marco. Much appreciated that you would watch. What is 27 pounds? How does an Orthodox have assurance of salvation? Well, you do and you don't. How does anybody, right? Because even the Protestants who believe in assurance of salvation, they actually also believe that they can be deceived, most of them.
Right.
So you're in no better existential situation than anybody else. So we have all those same texts that you have. But again, the question, of course, is we have to not delude ourselves, because we know that we can delude ourselves, that our heart is deceitful. We can fall into prelest. We can think, oh, I'm special. So we have assurance that we have participated in salvation. That's the point of things like baptism. The sacraments are a condescension of God to our created reality. He's using matter. He's using stuff to, the communion to remind us, and so that we can have a tangible connection to God. So in that sense, we have assurance of participation in grace, but whether we will all persevere remains to be seen. And so I think in a limited sense, we could say, yeah, with Augustine, not everybody will have the grace of perseverance. I'm not speaking in a strictly predestinarian sense. I'm just saying, loosely speaking, Augustine is correct in that idea. Bone Man 538-199, the will hath two writers, both return to source. Sounds like Neoplatonic stuff. I don't know if I agree with that.
It has two writers?
The will hath two writers, I guess, reason and the passions. I don't know. It's probably a quote from some text. I don't know. Both return to source. That sounds like Neoplatonic.
Yeah,
that sounds like Neoplatonic
New-agey,
mysticism.
like source energy or something.
Yeah. White Top, 1953, $2. Thank you, White Top. Much appreciated. I can't see this last one. Z Grom 40A's. Why does God have Adam and Eve go through this earthly mode rather than creating us to experience a different good in heaven from the outset? What did the Holy Father say? Why does God have Adam and Eve go through this earthly mode rather than creating us to experience? I don't fully understand your question. I'm sorry. I don't know what you mean by to experience a different, quote, good in heaven from the outset. The Holy Fathers say that Adam and Eve were created in a state of mutability so that they could be trained in virtue. And essentially we're all in that same situation in a loose sense, that we are having to learn to, as Maximus says, recapitulate the virtues in ourselves. So, not trying to be a jerk. I just don't really fully understand the question. Fresh whole milk. Go ahead.
Can I say something?
Sure.
One of the things that I had never heard until I got into Orthodoxy regarding Adam and Eve was like eating from the tree of knowledge was because they were in a sort of adolescent state.
Yeah,
it's not
there you
that
go.
the tree of knowledge was evil or anything like that.
Right.
It's because of where they are at in the process of theosis, which was always the sort of soteriological purpose, the teleological purpose of creation itself. I had never heard that before until I got into Orthodoxy. And it totally gives it a totally different context of everything than, oh, God said don't do it. You disobeyed God. God has to punish you.
Yeah. Fresh whole milk. Yeah, I did a video on the protests. You can watch my protest video. Put that up a couple days ago. So we won't go into that right now, but thank you for your $2.99 A's. You can watch my video on that. John Nathan, $2. What is the difference between what differentiates orthodoxy from semi-Pelagianism? This is kind of a complex question. Orthodoxy didn't have the same disputes about grace that the West had. So sometimes you'll see like John Cassian and these kind of people will be said, well, these guys are semi-Pelagian. It's complex because the East develops the doctrine of the energies, which becomes a faculty of nature. So nature can never lose its natural energy. So even fallen man can't lose his natural will and energy. It's still created. It's a created good. But this layer of anthropology will be lost in kind of in the Augustinian, post-Augustinian West, and then ultimately lost in Protestantism. They don't know what you're talking about. So there's not an easy, quick answer to why we're not semi-Pelagianism, except to say that the canons from the some of the synods of Carthage are reaffirmed in Trullo. And so Trullo being reaffirmed at Nicaea II, you do have the acceptance of aspects. I wouldn't say that the councils of Orange as a whole, all of the theology of Orange is necessarily transferred into Orthodoxy, but there's a little bit of wiggle room here, because the Sixth Council does affirm that Donatus is a heretic, and it does affirm that Augustine is a church father. Fifth and Sixth Councils do. And then, so technically, yes, semi-Pelagianism would also in a way be erroneous, because we would deny that you do anything apart from grace. But what we don't affirm is that the divine will or energy ever supplants, destroys, or overpowers the human will and energy, right? So we do affirm a distinction between nature and grace. Palamas says this consistently. But we don't think that they're in dialectical tension. They're in symphonia and harmony. So again, for us, the fall never meant that man lost his natural will and energy. It just, he lost the Holy Spirit and the uncreated divine life and was reduced to a natural state, Paul talks about. But even in the natural state, he retains the image of God. And part of the image of God is that human nature retains its own proper energy. So that's what's missing in dispute in the West after Augustine, because Augustine doesn't have these Eastern nuances. And that's why the debate gets really hairy and difficult, because it's not really in Orthodoxy to think in that way, because we always affirm synergy. Even in conversion, there's synergy, because of the way that the Sixth Council and Maximus will argue about, in the dispute with Pyrrhus, the two wills and the two energies in Christ. If Christ has human nature, then human nature must have its own will and energy. So there can't be bondage of the will, like Luther says. All right, that's impossible. Anyway, that's a really complex question, but more or less what I'm saying is just that the roughly speaking, we don't affirm any of the heresies, neither Donatism nor Pelagianism. And if you look at the Council of Trullo, the canons of Trullo, and which are affirming Carthage, you could. I'm getting tired, so I'm getting kind of like rambly. You could argue that we also don't affirm semi-Pelagianism, but we also don't think in the terms of semi-Pelagianism. So that's why it was never an issue in the East. All right, I'm getting a little too tired. I'm gonna have to do these other ones later, but thank you. I drove like 10 hours yesterday. So.
Oh, did you? How was vacation?
Good.
Beach life treat you well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just got a splitting headache. I apologize.
No, it's all good, brother.
All right, everybody follow David. And
Church of the Eternal Logos.
Church of the Eternal.
Check out my website.
I've got his link there. I've got his link. So everybody follow him.
Thanks for having me on, brother. I appreciate it. And we'll have to do the second half sometime.
All right. God bless.
All right.